continue with the measures announced as far as the rupee is concerned. Again, expectation in the market that the Reserve Bank will act as and when appropriate. What is it that you expect now? And I want to ask the question on monetary policy because, there are people that believe that an interest rate hike is now inevitable. Of course, an interest rate hike may not necessarily be used as an instrument to combat the depreciation as far as the rupee is concerned. So what's the take on what you expect from the Reserve Bank?
I expect the Reserve Bank to do its job through the Monetary Policy Committee, take a call on what is going to drive inflation going forward over the next 2 or 3 quarters. There are many factors that could drive inflation, and one of them could be external account factors. For instance, a rise in the price of oil, inelastic demand, and therefore a transmission effect into inflation. What I do not expect the Reserve Bank to do, and I'm confident they will not do it, is act on a potential component of inflation. So what I expect the Reserve Bank to do is that if current external account events feed into inflationary expectations, then I expect them to take action. Otherwise, I do not. And that is why the Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Committee meets 5 times a year. So knee-jerk reactions I do not expect. I don't think they're on the cards. I think the Reserve Bank will take a view on domestic and external factors that may impact inflation going forward, and then take a decision on what to do with the instrument at their disposal, the interest rate, to keep inflation within the agreed policy band.
So no knee-jerk reaction, that's your expectation from the Reserve Bank. You spoke of imports, and that's an idea that you welcome, that import substitution should be looked at by the government in earnest. But what about export incentivization? I think, and I spoke with a whole host of people, and the consensus was that not enough has been done to actually push the cause of exports in the last few years. And that must be now done on a war footing. So as we look at the issue of import substitution, what about export incentivization, which again, the government has expressed its intent to do?
As a public economist, I can't help using this analogy. If we talk about raising taxes, other than raising tax rates, that depends on a host of factors. When we talk about cutting expenditure, it is well within government's control. So if we have a current account deficit that is causing problems, then what the government can do in the immediate term is look at ways in which to reduce imports, and importantly, that involves in some way or the other import substitution. With exports, the only short-term thing you can do is incentivize them in price terms. And the best incentive then for exports is depreciation. However, we know from the literature and from lessons past that Indian exports respond more to changes in world demand and to changes in domestic productivity than to price depreciation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a problem. The rupee is depreciating, exports would rise, imports would fall. But that is not happening because the elasticities don't work that way. Therefore, the application of incentives to exports is not going to have even a sort of annual term effect on exports. Of course, we need to increase exports, but that involves looking at productivity and at looking at world market demand conditions. However, I think many things can be done to promote a slower growth rate in imports, including sort of import substitution measures. And so the government has quite sensibly decided to focus on those. So the key takeaway here is incentives mean affecting prices, but exports do not respond to prices, and therefore the scope for those measures, in my view, in the short to medium term is limited.
Okay. I want to talk about imports because you said that the government is not thinking about controls, but it's thinking about substitution. As our report said, that a panel has been set up headed by the Cabinet Secretary, and it's looking at about 5 areas or 5 sectors at this point in time. But, isn't that going to play out in the medium to long term and not necessarily in the short to immediate term?
Well, that is what the panel has got to find out. I'm not on the panel, but if I were to depose before it, I would say that there are certain immediate areas where we can actually mute at least the growth of imports, essentially by making sure that we shift the pattern of our consumption demand into areas where the consumption of all Indians is affected, and the consumption of Indians of certain things, such as, for example, luxury electronics, is discouraged. I think their price signals would work in the short to medium term. It's not as if I'm against food imports, but heck, if people are importing iPhones, I need to take a look at what I can do to discourage them from importing iPhones, right? And if I can do that across a spectrum of areas, even if there's a relatively small inframarginal impact in the short run, it does two things. That small inframarginal impact sends a signal saying that the government is now saying for the first time it is very serious about import substitution. This is not some fudge like Make in India, Make for India. They're saying directly, we have appointed a committee under the highest civil servant in the land to look at measures for import substitution. There will be short-term measures. These will cascade into medium-term measures. And if that works, then I think we will actually have brought the balance of payments under control without compromising on important things like essential consumption and capital goods.
Yeah,
and other
but
stuff
the immediate term would mean price action. It would mean a higher tariff, wouldn't it?
That is one of the things you could do, impose a higher tariff. The other thing you could do is examine whether the kinds of market conditions that exist for luxury imports to thrive and to discount may be muted. My own personal opinion is we need to take a good hard look at the aviation sector, for example, I'm sticking my neck out here, and ask whether it is a national priority that aviation, passenger aviation grows at the rate that it grows. And the number of price actions you could take there, a number of sort of incentive or disincentive actions you could take there. There's a whole spectrum of them you could do. And I hope, I'm not in the committee, that the committee will be pragmatic in this fashion and look at things sector by sector and ask who's doing the importing. And having done that, either send out signals that such importing will not be actively encouraged and where possible discouraged without going into extreme steps like quantitative controls. We're beyond that now. And I'm confident that there is ample scope for this to happen in small measure to begin with, but with a cascading effect in the medium term. This is definitely an important nationalist change in policy, which I welcome.
Okay, you welcome this policy, though this is up for debate. The former Commerce Secretary Rahul Kullar, the former RBI Deputy Governor Rakesh Mohan were on my program, and the former Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha just yesterday saying that they think that this is not a good idea at this point in time. So you wouldn't agree with that?
The past is no guide for the future. And the three entities you mentioned have worked in the past, and they have great expertise, but the past is no guide to the future.
Okay. Since we're talking about the current account deficit, let me also now get you to focus on the fiscal deficit. The government came out and said that they're very confident of being able to maintain the 3.3% fiscal deficit target. But the worry is that can you really make up on the direct taxes front what the shortfall is on the indirect tax front? GST collections, by all accounts, short at least 10,000 crores every month. Are you concerned not just about the current account, but also the fiscal deficit at this point?
I would have been very concerned if the government was anything less than totally unambivalent that the fiscal deficit target will be respected. I am also confident that any shortfalls that you may see on the indirect tax front will be compensated on the direct tax front. There's enough cushion there. I'd like to point out to your viewers that I said this at the time of the budget, that the government was extremely conservative in terms of percentage of GDP in projecting increases in the direct tax GDP ratio. Therefore, I genuinely believe there's some elbow room there. With GST, I continue to believe the jury is still out. It is likely, though by no means certain, that the target will not be met. I could be wrong. There's a long time to go. But the magnitude of that shortfall, I do not think, will be of an order that cannot be managed by countervailing revenue gains.
Okay. Okay, so that's what you hope will meet the deficit on the indirect tax side as well, as and when the government decides to go down that route. But let me end then by asking you, what would you be most concerned about?
And what I want to say very clearly is that nothing that is happening today.
Yes. Go ahead.
Nothing that is happening today merits using any sort of event that is happening today to argue for the government not to strictly adhere to its fiscal deficit target. Nothing happening today or in the foreseeable future warrants such an argument. And I sincerely hope that when the pre-budget discussions happen, this will not be used to put further pressure on the finance minister to relax his target, as the private sector has regrettably done many years now. It is irresponsible and this must stop.
I'll end. Absolutely, and it shouldn't be an election budget. It should be a reasoned budget. That's the consensus in the community that we speak with as well. But Ratin, I'll end by asking you, in order of priority, the challenges on the macro front, and in order of priority, the action that you would like to see.
Challenges on the macro front, number one, stick with the policy framework you have framed. You have framed a policy framework where you have set out a clear roadmap for keeping the fiscal deficit under control. Stick to it. You have set out a policy framework where we have declared our intention to keep inflation within a quantitative target, and whether you agree with the analytical framework or not, there's a monetary policy committee that uses the instrument available to it, the interest rate, to deal with inflation. Do not mix up aims and means by using that instrument for something else. On the exchange rate front, I think it is salutary in the medium term that we have finally recognized that our current account deficit is structural and therefore needs structural measures, and there must be no no-go areas based on past neoliberal or any other kind of thinking. Everything is open for discussion. We will be conservative and cautious, I hope, in the decisions we take, but that does not mean we will not be courageous. And I'm quite sort of fortified by recent announcements that the government is not afraid to be courageous in signaling its intent to tackle this problem. Whether we are able to tackle this problem effectively depends on more than government. It depends on industry, other stakeholders. But that is definitely the big challenge ahead that we need to do. In an increasingly uncertain and volatile environment, we have to bring the current account deficit under control. Yep. That means we have to moderate import growth. We have to moderate luxury import growth. And we have to do what we can, other than pricing, to improve productivity and address world global demand to both diversify and increase the rate of export growth.
We'll have to leave it there. Ratin Roy, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 with your thoughts on the measures announced and the road ahead. Appreciate your time. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this CNBC TV 18 special. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.